Thank you very much. I am a clinical psychologist, as Debbie said, and I'm the founder and owner of Pitts & Associates. I also worked with a large practice in Homewood, Grayson & Associates, for 13 years, started my practice 10 years ago, and I started my career at Children's for 3 years after I graduated from graduate school. But I'm a Homewood boy, grew up right here on this very dirt, and went to Shades Cahaba and Homewood Middle School, Homewood High School, Birmingham Southern, and then eventually Baylor University, where I got my doctorate. And so, all right, I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a fairly good understanding of what attention deficit disorder is. I think you entitled this, new trends in ADHD. So let me spend 5 or 6 minutes just covering the basics with ADHD. It is a neurological disorder. So now it is in my opinion, overdiagnosed and over-medicated. But I don't want to give the wrong idea. We have many different medications for ADHD that can be very helpful. Now, when I say, first of all, when I say ADHD, which is the official name, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, that includes the types of attention deficit disorder that don't have hyperactivity. So we used to have it right, in my opinion. We called it ADD, Attention Deficit Disorder, with hyperactivity or without hyperactivity. That was DSM-3. DSM-4, if you just have the attention problems, now it's called Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, predominantly inattentive type. So little inefficient in my book, but they didn't ask me what I thought. So. But it is a neurological disorder, and you can think of really usually 3 clusters of symptoms are given. The attention deficit symptoms, which means a short span of attention, a weak focus of attention. You're not tuned in sharply. And then all the other problems that come from that, difficulty listening, difficulty with remembering things, losing things, forgetting, but a lot of it is just not absorbing all of what's going on at the time, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. The second cluster of symptoms are the impulsivity or poor impulse control symptoms, and you can think of this as behavioral impulsivity. Stronger engine than brakes, not being able to stop and think before you act. Then we have the physical hyperactivity symptoms. And remember, you can have just the attention deficit without the impulsivity or hyperactivity symptoms. I like to include a 4th cluster, I'm not the only one, but a 4th cluster of symptoms that often goes along with ADHD, which is emotional overreactivity and moodiness. So you've got hyperactivity in the behavioral realm, in the emotional realm, and even in the mental realm. That part of why we have an attention deficit is because our mind senses a problem in our midbrain. I'm going to tell you about that in just a second, where this comes from. And our mind is trying to compensate for the problem. So our mind is desperately trying to find something that's interesting, because you can focus better when you're interested in something, and that's anybody. But here's the way it looks. Let's think about a non-ADHD group versus an ADHD group. If we go with the non-ADHD group, of course, they can pay attention better to the things they're interested in than the things they're not interested in. That's normal. And we've done many research studies with children, adolescents and adults, and it looks like this. We'll start with the non-ADHD group. And when they're interested, this is the high level. Interested. And then there's a measurable difference statistically that when they're bored. Sorry, I'm not a very good writing on a board. Now, the ADHD group looks like this. You can pay attention just as well, sometimes better, if you're interested. Because people with ADHD can do something called hyper-focusing. That is another compensatory attempt on the part of the brain. But when you go to something that's mundane and boring, the bottom falls out. You know, and that makes a huge difference. Your brain is supposed to help you. Your brain can sense when things become less interesting for you out here, like out of your brain. When you're really interested in something, you lean into it, it's easy to pay attention to it. You love it, it's reinforcing. But when you have to sit through math class, you know, it's going, it gets hard. And so, very interesting study was done about 30 years ago, the first of this type of studies at the University of Montreal, where they had 1,000 kids, fifth graders with ADHD, and 1,000 in a control group without ADHD. And the first thing they tested it on was a video game, and this was nothing like today's video game. This was almost like a Pong. You know, you remember the, you know, very simple, but at that time that was cool, and so they were going to be focused on that. And the reason I think they were fifth graders, of course, in my day we did. In the fifth grade, we learned long division. You know, I think they're learning that like in the third grade now or something. But anyway, so they gave both sets of kids, they gave them a small dose of Ritalin to see what would happen. Because the old myth was that if you didn't have ADHD, taking a stimulant would not help you. That wasn't true. All the kids paid attention better on Ritalin. But when you're dealing with this much of a drop versus this much, and the medicine, on average, improved the attentional functioning about 70%. So about 70%, so it brought it back up that much, and about 70% brought it up about that much. Many physicians used to ask, they'd give people Ritalin, this was way back in the 70s, and they'd say, try some of this, you know, oh, so you can't focus, and you're a little restless sometimes, and sometimes you don't act before you think. And you know, those are very common symptoms for all of us on a bad day, or if we're tired. Well, try some of this, and if it helps, then you've got attention deficit disorder. But it's going to help everybody pay attention. You know, why do we all drink that warm black juice in the morning? You know, that's a stimulant too. And so Ritalin, Dexedrine, Adderall, Focalin, those are all stimulants. But I tell parents all the time, this much change is not worth, I mean, it's not right to put your child on medication. And you know, if you want to get your child from a B+ to an A-, that's but this amount of change can be life-changing. And this can mean the difference between years of low self-esteem, depression, closed doors, lost opportunities, and just the suffering of not feeling like you're able to get as much information out of life. So, it needs to be a pervasive problem with not being able to pay attention at the very least, plus the other problems with impulsivity and hyperactivity. All right. Now let me give you some of the update to tell you kind of where the research is now. That research studies have shown that brains of people with ADHD show some minor differences, especially in the frontal lobes, where the frontal lobes govern impulse control, organization, and planning. A lot of what we call the executive skills in the brain. Another executive skill is working memory. It's like short-term memory, but it's more than just your memory. It only operates for a few seconds, but it allows you to hold information so that you can make some kind of decision unconsciously about how you're going to use that information. So that's called working memory. But one study showed that after correction for weight, IQ, and other factors, people with ADHD, their brain is 3 to 4% smaller than people without ADHD. Other studies have shown that people with ADHD have less gray matter in the frontal lobes, which is really not surprising. You know, these areas that have to do with organization and planning, there's just not as many neurons. That's what the gray matter is. Those are nerve cells. The nerve cells are like wires that carry pulses of electricity. They're like little power stations. God made in each nerve cell the ability to generate a pulse of electricity and to carry it down to the end and to pass it along to the next nerve cell. I'm not going to answer that call. Lastly, we find that people with ADHD, they have relatively low levels, high levels of the excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate and relatively low levels of the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA. I'm not going to test you on this, but all throughout the brain and body we have a balance between excitatory processes and inhibitory processes. That you can think of the excitatory processes like the engine, and the inhibitory is like the brakes and the steering. Like, I'll give you an example. If I decided that I wanted to go shake Debbie's hand, my brain would send that impulse and the message down to my leg muscle so I could move over and hold up my hand. So that impulse was generated by my excitatory neurons. But what if I wanted to shake Debbie's hand, but I sprinted that way and busted your camera? You know, so if I want to go to shake Debbie's hand, I need to go that way. And also I don't need to sprint, you know, because what if I went toward Debbie, but I flew across the table and ended up in Mike Hathorn's lap, you know? And we're friends, but, you know, still. So it makes sense that we would find too much of the excitatory neurotransmitter in the frontal lobe and not enough of the inhibitory, because that's a lot of, like I said, it's behavioral hyperactivity, emotional hyperactivity, mental hyperactivity. There's way too much engine and not enough steering and brakes with ADHD. Heredity, we also know from research, is the major factor that contributes to the possibility that one will have ADHD. It's in your genes, like just about everything else. Heredity accounts for 60 to 70% of the variance, and that's a big chunk. There are other factors that we haven't fully teased out in research, but we know that if you have ADHD, the chance that a brother, sister, child, or parent is going to have it of yours is going to be as high as 1 out of 3. There's some studies that have shown much higher causality than that. Like one well-controlled study of preschoolers with ADHD, those parents were 25 times as likely to have, at least one of the parents were 25 times as likely as the general populations. We're now getting to the point that we want to know exactly which genes are involved with ADHD. since we know there's such a big genetic causality. And we have found a region on chromosome 16, so you can impress people, that we think it's on chromosome 16. And it's either one or probably more than one gene on that chromosome. Interestingly, other research has found genes for autism in the same region. So, but that really shouldn't surprise us, because there's a good deal of overlap between some of the symptoms of like Tourette's disorder, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and OCD as well, obsessive compulsive disorder. So there's also preliminary evidence for common genes underlying a predisposition to ADHD and reading disabilities. So several of these things, the more that we understand the brain, the more that we'll be able to understand what's going on. Now, we can't give somebody a brain scan to diagnose it, because when I was talking before about the ADHD brain perhaps being slightly smaller, that's all within the normal range of variance. And so it's not anything that would stand out. Like there are people without ADHD, some that would be smaller than that, but we're talking about averages. So for many decades, questions have come up about stimulants and addiction risk. The reason that the questions come up, the stimulants, basically, of all the different medicines, they're all derived from either dexedrine or Ritalin. You have the dexedrine side that has dexedrine, Adderall, Vyvanse, and a few other variants on those medicines. And then you have the Ritalin side that's Ritalin, Metadate, Concerta, and the Ritalin patch called Daytrana, which is an excellent medicine. It's just that insurance companies often don't pay for it because it's expensive. I have gotten a number of people to get their insurance company to pay for it, but what we have to do is we have to have the pediatrician try this kid or the adult on every stimulant made and show that it doesn't work as well as the patch. But what we're finding with a lot of medicines, not just this one, the skin is a much better regulator of something osmosing into the blood than the gut. Because when you eat something, it dissolves in the stomach and you have all that juice that goes right into the bloodstream. Now, long-acting medicines, they have maybe half of the medicine with a thicker coating that wears off in about 4 hours, so that then it gets released. But even that, people's stomachs can have widely differing pHs. Some people have more stomach acid, and some people are just rapid metabolizers of what goes through their gut. And so as a result, the medicine doesn't last as long. Whereas skin is pretty much skin. Everybody's skin, it's a much more even flow. And if you think of the skin greatly magnified, it has many layers, but you put on the patch and the medicine starts osmosing through the skin, and then it gets through the skin and it osmoses through a blood vessel right into the bloodstream. And then it keeps traveling through all day. And then when you take off the patch, then the back edge of it moves through the skin. But Daytrana, it lasts. You don't have the peaks and valleys. It's a steady flow all day long. Vyvanse is one of the newer medicines that helps. Concerta is one of the ones that came out about 15 years ago. It's Ritalin. And it creates a pretty steady flow through the day. And Vyvanse is one that's even more even, but it doesn't work for everybody. But So, but I tell you what, the wave of the future is the patch. Now, the only thing about it is there's still, Daytrana, which is the patch form of Ritalin, has been out for about 10 years. And they've changed the adhesive 3 times because they're really trying to make it where people with really sensitive skin, you know, it can leave a little bit of a red spot. Usually with kids that I've had that need to be on that, parents are happy to work around that. I mean, put some Vaseline on it or some lotion, and it's not a big deal. And, you know, just move it around the bum, and it's not that much of a problem. But not many people get to use Daytrana, and I couldn't afford to pay for it out of pocket. So it's you know, like $200 or $300 a month for a month worth of patches. But anyway, because stimulants, and don't let me scare you here, okay? These stimulants actually, they are amphetamines, and they resemble cocaine in their mechanism of action. That really is just saying that chemically they get into the bloodstream and they do the same things, but you know, a controlled dosage of Ritalin and you know, an uncontrolled dosage of cocaine, those are 2 very different things. But because stimulants resemble that, for decades we've worried about whether medical use can be addictive in itself or raise the risk of addiction to other drugs or alcohol when you get into adolescence and adulthood. And luckily now we've been using Ritalin since the 70s, and we've been using dexedrine since the early 60s. Dexedrine was actually created during World War II to help pilots that had to fly the long flights across the Pacific. So you know, on a 4-prop plane, that would still be a 20-hour flight for some of those leaving California. Or I don't know what it would be from Honolulu, but or Pearl Harbor, but anyway, it was a long flight. So we developed dexedrine to help the pilots stay awake. But we now have many long-term studies that show us that stimulant treatment of ADHD has not been found to raise the risk of addiction in human beings. It does raise the addiction in rats, but our nervous systems are different, and so it doesn't raise the rate of addiction potential in human beings. So, and that's many, many, many studies. There's research that shows that children with ADHD who did not take stimulants have twice the average rate of substance abuse. So, and that makes some sense when you think about it. When I was talking about that, you know, all the missed opportunities, the depression, the anxiety of having to function without being able to take in all the information. You can see how that might set somebody up for substance abuse. There are some problems with this research because there are some prior characteristics like socioeconomic class, for example, that might have raised the risk both for going untreated and for later drug problems. And it's going to be hard to tell exactly who's, you know, if there's risk, because it involves getting a group of people with ADHD, children, and giving one set a stimulant and giving the other set a placebo. And really that's considered unethical, you know, to not give somebody treatment for a problem. That's the only way you could truly know if there's a meaningful association that leads to addiction. But we don't think that's the case. And I'll tell you, I've been a psychologist for almost 26 years, and with very well controlled medication use, you know, it's not a problem. Now, these are medicines that can be abused. So, you they are amphetamines, and people can abuse amphetamines. But when they're used as directed, we do not see a problem with that. Vyvanse is actually one of the neat things about Vyvanse, because most of the time when young people or any age abuse stimulants, they crush it, and they crush it and snort it like cocaine. Or they boil it in a spoon and they shoot it into their veins. Pretty scary. But you can't do that with Vyvanse. They made it where you can't crush it. They coated the stimulant in Vyvanse is a lot like Adderall. But they coated the stimulant with a protein called lysine, and it's bound to the amphetamine molecules, and if you crush it, the lysine pulls the amphetamine molecules apart. So if you crush it, it becomes inert. It won't do anything. So that was pretty neat that they put an anti-abuse protection, but Vyvanse is also an excellent medication. So there's another. How many people have heard of Intuniv? IN, kind of a cute name that some marketer came up with, Intuniv. You can be in tune with Intuniv. So now Intuniv, if you've heard of the blood pressure medicine 10X, it's the same thing. It's guanfacine. But it's time-release guanfacine. And actually, Intuniv has been one of the most successful non-stimulant medicines to come around. This is a medicine that impacts the adrenal system. If I describe to you, if you think about impulsivity, it's kind of like, and distractibility, like, what? Squirrel, and so you're being yanked. You're too attentive to anything. You don't have anything filtered. And God wired into us a protective system, the adrenal system, and it's like, what? And when we're being yanked here, there, our protective system stays very high, because it's kind of like you don't know what's about to pop out of the bushes over here. So, and impulsivity too. That there's some adrenaline in there when you often for risk-taking behavior for children or teens with ADD. So there's the adrenaline. The adrenal system stays constantly stirred up, and that's one of the reasons that very impulsive or hyperactive children, by the end of the day, sometimes they have dark circles under their eyes. I mean, they just can't slow down. They go from 100 miles an hour to asleep. And sometimes they don't sleep very well, because your sleeping is going to mirror your neurological activity when you're sleeping is going to mirror your neurological activity when you're awake. And so if you're way too active when you're awake, you're going to be way too active usually when you're sleeping. So it can be devastating. But you can see now why this is something that calms down the adrenals. It kind of brings down without leaving you unprotected adrenaline-wise, it calms down some of the excess adrenaline. And you would expect that would help with impulsivity and hyperactivity. The amazing thing is it even helps with focusing. Because we had used 10X or guanfacine, regular guanfacine, for years with kids. Sometimes if you have, again, a highly hyperactive, impulsive kid, a stimulant is almost always going to help them focus better. it's not always going to help them with some of the disinhibited behaviors, the impulsivity, the hyperactivity. So we often have to combine medicines. We want a stimulant usually, and then in the old days we might give the kid 10X, 3 or even 4 times a day just to help them put on the brakes. And so we knew that 10X or guanfacine, which is Intuniv, helped with braking, but Intuniv often is a standalone medication for ADHD. It's also an excellent medicine when combined with a stimulant that sometimes enables you to take less of the stimulant. And that's good. I mean, we like that. Whenever we don't forget that this is an amphetamine, and we like it when people can take less and get enough of a benefit. So I'm not going to talk much longer because I want to leave a lot of time for questions. There are also liquid forms of Adderall. It's called methylene oral, and there's a liquid form of Ritalin that's called Quilivant. And I've told you about Daytrana, the patch. Another neat thing in dealing with ADHD is the rise of digital devices and how much people with ADHD are leaning on these. I mean, there are apps for ADD. There are apps for kids. There's one that can every couple of minutes you can program in your name. It says, "Are you staying with your work?" And so and it's really cool. But in terms of helping you efficiently to remember things, Mike wasn't at Homewood High School when I was a student there, but yeah. I actually have ADHD, and I'm treated for it. I didn't start to get treated for it until I became a psychologist. So mine, I wasn't out of control, but I was wiggly and pretty impulsive. Luckily, most of my impulsivity was off school grounds, but I was basically a good kid. Thank heavens I had a guilty conscience and good child, good parenting. So, but there are many apps and people are using technology more. I tell you, I just got an iPhone. I think I was the last American to have a BlackBerry. But my daughters and wife made fun of me a lot. But boy, I would use the scheduling function all the time. I'd tell myself, don't forget about this. And that's the problem with ADHD. You think about something, and if you don't write it down, it's gone. And so I had a code that I would give myself for, I need to think about that program coming up in 2 weeks that I have to do at my church or at this school or whatever. Or I need to tell my wife blah, blah, blah. She's the business manager at our practice. And so I would give myself a reminder to think about it, and to think, not just think about it, but take it to the next level, do something about it. So anyway, there are some very good magazines available. Have any of you ever seen Attention magazine? Or there's another one called Attitude that's spelled with ADDITUDE. They're both very good magazines. So we have some great publications now that have articles for adults and for parents. But the bottom line is, while we do have many good medicines, it's important to get a good evaluation, which usually is going to be 2 or 3 sessions, in order to have the time for a thorough history, because many things can look like ADHD that are not ADHD. You know, again, these are not common, uncommon symptoms to be distractible, to be restless. There are many things that can cause that. But a good evaluation that uses standardized checklists, and the way we evaluated, many other psychologists, we include a call to the teacher. Psychologists and licensed counselors diagnose ADHD without ever having talked to the teacher. You know, I mean, that's the most important one to talk to. Not only because that teacher sees the kid when they're in a situation where you need to focus the most of all, but also if you think about the norms. I mean, nobody knows what's normal for a fourth grader better than a fourth grade teacher. That's all that he or she deals with is fourth graders. So you have a really exquisite sense of what stands out, what's different from the norm. So, thank you.